She was holding a glass of water, not champagne, standing at the edge of a ballroom full of people who had no idea what she had done for the company whose anniversary they were celebrating. Her husband stood at the microphone 40 feet away, mid-toast, and something in the set of his shoulders told her, before he said a single word, that whatever came next was not going to be about gratitude. Her name was Haley Crawford, though for 4 years now she had also answered to Harlow, her husband's family name, the name printed on the banner behind the stage in gold letters 2 feet tall, Harlow Freight and Fabrication, 40 years of building America. She was 7 months pregnant. Her feet ached inside shoes she had chosen for how they looked rather than how they felt, and she had been standing in them for 2 hours, smiling at people whose names she mostly remembered, accepting congratulations on the baby from men who had known her husband since he was a boy and had never once asked her a single question about her own life before she married into this family. Max Harlow was good at toasts. He had given dozens of them, at weddings, at retirement dinners, at the opening of a new distribution center outside Worcester 2 years back, and he had the rhythm of it down the way some men have the rhythm of a golf swing, something practiced until it no longer looked practiced. Tonight he was thanking the board, thanking the drivers and the warehouse staff, thanking his father Raymond, who sat near the front in a wheelchair he had needed for the better part of a year now, nodding along with the particular pride of a man watching his son carry something forward. And then Max's eyes moved across the room and found Haley, and he smiled the smile he used when he wanted a laugh, and he said, "And of course, I have to thank my wife, who has been so supportive through all of this. Haley's been with me every step of the way. Mostly the easy steps. She's better at picking out napkin colors than reading a balance sheet, but hey, that's what I married her for." The room laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the laugh of people who did not know they were laughing at something true turned inside out, the laugh of an audience that trusted the man holding the microphone to know his own marriage better than anyone watching it. A few women near Haley exchanged a glance, the kind that says, "Well, that was a little much," but said nothing more than that. Raymond, in his wheelchair, chuckled the way fathers do at jokes about their daughters-in-law, fondly, uncritically. Haley did not laugh. She did not flinch either, not visibly. She had spent a long time learning the difference between a feeling and a performance of a feeling, and right now what she did was set her glass of water down on the nearest table, very gently, so it made no sound at all, and she walked toward the side exit of the ballroom with the particular calm of a woman who has decided, in real time, not to give anyone in that room the version of her reaction they might have been hoping for. She did not run. She did not cry, not yet. She walked past the coat check, past a server holding a tray of something she could no longer remember the smell of, out into a parking lot lit by sodium lamps that turned every car the same flat orange, and she sat in the driver's seat of her own car for almost 4 minutes before she put the key in the ignition, because her hands were not steady enough to trust with the act of driving. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Today's warm shout-out goes to Jocelyn from the United States, Wanda from Georgia, and Juliet from Jamaica. Thank you for being part of our family. Subscribe now and comment below so I can welcome you too. What Max did not know, what almost no one in that ballroom knew, was that 6 years earlier, before there had been a ring on her finger or a banner with gold letters, Haley Crawford had spent 11 months keeping Harlow Freight and Fabrication from going under. He had built none of the 4 decades he had just thanked his father for. She had not built them either. But she had been the reason there was a 40th anniversary to celebrate it all, instead of a quiet liquidation a few years into their marriage, and she had agreed, at the time, to let that fact disappear. It is worth sitting with how a person arrives at an agreement like that. It rarely happens all at once. Haley had grown up 40 minutes outside of Springfield, Massachusetts, in a house that smelled, for most of her childhood, like sawdust and engine grease, because her father Earl Crawford ran a building supply company out of what had started as a single rented storefront when Haley was 4 years old. Earl was not a flashy man. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation for years at a time, drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it long after he could afford a new one, and kept his company's books himself for the first decade because he did not trust anyone else to understand, the way he understood, exactly how close to the edge they were running in those early years. Haley used to sit on the floor of his office after school, doing homework on a clipboard, listening to him talk through cash flow problems on the phone with suppliers, watching him solve, again and again, the particular puzzle of how to keep a small business breathing through a bad season. She did not realize, at the time, that she was being trained for anything. It felt like simply being near her father. By the time Earl Crawford's company had grown into a regional chain of building supply stores across western Massachusetts and northern Connecticut, Haley had a finance degree, 3 years of experience at a regional bank evaluating small business loans, and an instinct for reading a balance sheet the way some people read a room. She had also, by then, met Max Harlow at a fundraiser for a local children's hospital, and she had liked him immediately, the easy warmth of him, the way he remembered small details about people he had just met, the way he made her laugh on their second date so hard she had to put her fork down. She did not know, then, that the company bearing his family's name was 11 months from collapse. She found out the way a person finds out most uncomfortable truths about the people they love, which is gradually, in pieces, through things that do not quite add up. Max had mentioned, early in their relationship, that the freight business was going through a rough patch, the way people describe weather, something passing and outside anyone's control. It was Raymond, actually, who let slip the real shape of it, over a dinner about 8 months into Haley and Max's relationship, after 2 glasses of wine had loosened something in him that pride usually kept tight. Raymond Harlow had built Harlow Freight from 2 trucks and a rented lot in 1981. By the time Haley met his son, the company had survived a recession, a fuel crisis, and the slow strangulation of trucking deregulation, but what it had not yet survived, in the spring of that year, was a financing arrangement that Raymond himself, in a moment of expansion-minded overconfidence 3 years earlier, had signed onto without fully understanding the covenants buried in it. "We're a few bad months from the bank calling the whole thing due," Raymond had said that night, quietly, more to his wine glass than to anyone at the table, and then he had looked up and seen Haley's face and laughed it off, said something about how every business has its rough patches, asked her to pass the bread. Haley did not pass it off so easily. She had spent her whole working life around exactly this kind of problem, and something in her, something trained into her on the floor of her father's office, would not let it go. She asked Max, gently, over the following weeks, what he knew about the company's finances. He knew less than she expected. He had grown up assuming Harlow Freight would simply continue, the way children of successful men often do, and his role at the company at that point was mostly logistics and client relationships, areas where he was genuinely talented, but a long way from the loan documents that were quietly threatening to end the whole enterprise. It took Haley 3 weeks of asking careful questions, and one direct conversation with Raymond where she simply asked to see the numbers, before anyone showed her the actual covenant structure of the debt. When she finally saw it laid out, she understood within an hour what was wrong, and within a week she had a plan for how it might be fixed. The company was not failing because it was poorly run, not in any fundamental sense. It was failing because of a financing structure that had been built for a different version of the business than the one that now existed, and because nobody at Harlow Freight had the specific expertise to renegotiate it before the covenants triggered. Haley had that expertise. And she had something else, something that mattered just as much: she had her father. Earl Crawford had spent 4 decades building relationships with regional lenders, with other small business owners who had been through their own near collapses and come out the other side, with people who understood that a company in trouble was not the same thing as a company without a future. When Haley came to him, not asking for money but asking for a connection, an introduction to a regional lender he trusted who might restructure Harlow Freight's debt on workable terms, Earl made one phone call. It was enough to open a door. What it took to walk through that door, to negotiate the actual terms, to personally guarantee a portion of the restructured loan because the new lender wanted additional security from someone besides a company already on its knees, was 11 months of Haley's evenings and weekends, a stack of spreadsheets that eventually filled 2 binders, and a willingness to put her own name, her own modest savings, and a measure of her own financial future on the line for a company she did not yet legally belong to. She remembered the night they signed the restructuring agreement more clearly than she remembered her own wedding toast, 2 years later. It was a Tuesday. The conference room at the lender's office smelled like burnt coffee and new carpet. Raymond cried, openly, the kind of crying that men of his generation rarely allowed themselves in front of other people, and he gripped Haley's hand across the table and said, "I don't know how to thank you for this," and meant it completely. And it was that same night, in the parking lot afterward, that Max asked her for something that would shape the next 6 years of their marriage before it had even begun. "My dad can't know it was really you," he said, not unkindly, his voice low and a little desperate in a way she had not heard from him before. "I mean, he knows you helped. But if the board finds out his daughter-in-law is the one who actually restructured the company, that I didn't have a real hand in saving it, it changes how everyone looks at me here. I've got people under me. Drivers who've been with my dad for 30 years. If they think I just married into the solution instead of being part of it, I don't know how I run this place." Haley remembered standing there in the cold, her hand still faintly aching from the signing pen, and feeling two things at once that did not resolve easily into one feeling. She understood him. She had grown up around a man, her own father, who had built his identity entirely around being capable, around being the one who solved the problem, and she recognized the particular fear in Max's voice as something close to that, dressed in younger, less weathered clothes. And she also felt, underneath the understanding, something quieter and more uncertain, a small voice asking whether agreeing to disappear from her own accomplishment was a kindness or the first brick in a wall she would spend years building without noticing. She told herself, that night, that it was generosity. She told herself that love sometimes meant stepping back so someone else could stand taller, that this was a small thing to give a man she intended to spend her life with, that the marriage itself, when it came 18 months later, would matter more than who got credit for a financing arrangement nobody outside that boardroom would ever think about again. She did not understand, not yet, that there is a difference between stepping back once and learning to make a habit of it. If you have ever agreed to something in a relationship that felt small in the moment, something you told yourself did not really matter, only to look back years later and see how much of yourself had quietly gone missing in the space that agreement opened up, you already understand something about what came next in Haley's life that this story has not yet told you. The years between that parking lot conversation and the night of the 40th anniversary gala did not unfold as a single dramatic decline. They unfolded the way most marriages actually change, in small adjustments that each seemed reasonable on their own. Max's role at the company grew, and with it grew a version of the company's history in which he had been more central to its survival than he actually was, a version that started, perhaps, as a kind of protective fiction and slowly became something closer to a story he told himself and half believed. Raymond, now in his 70s and increasingly reliant on a wheelchair after a stroke 2 years back, leaned more and more on Max as the company's public face, grooming him to take over the chairman's role eventually, proud of the son who had, in his understanding, helped pull the family business back from the edge. Haley, meanwhile, had stepped into a quieter role. She managed some of the company's vendor relationships from home, work that was real and valuable but invisible, the kind of labor that does not show up on an organizational chart. She had also, over those years, slowly stopped mentioning her own background in finance at company events, stopped correcting people who assumed she had married into money rather than having grown up watching her father build it, stopped, eventually, even bringing it up with Max, because the few times she had, early on, he had grown tense in a way that made the conversation not worth having. It was Patricia Doyle, the company's longtime bookkeeper, a woman in her 60s who had been doing Harlow Freight's books since before Max was born, who first noticed that something in the marriage had shifted into territory beyond ordinary distance. Patricia had always liked Haley, had in fact been one of the very few people who knew, in real detail, what Haley had actually done during the restructuring 6 years earlier, because Patricia had been the one entering the numbers into the system every week during those 11 months, watching the company's position slowly stabilize. Patricia did not say anything to Haley directly, not at first. But she noticed the hotel charge on a corporate card that did not correspond to any client meeting on the calendar. She noticed, twice, a name on a dinner reservation that was not Haley's. She noticed the particular way Max had started speaking about a marketing consultant the company had brought on 8 months earlier, a woman named Vanessa Reyes, with a warmth in his voice that seemed disproportionate to a working relationship. Vanessa was 31, sharp, ambitious in a way she had earned through real effort rather than inherited advantage, having worked her way up through 2 smaller logistics firms before landing the consulting contract with Harlow Freight. She was good at her job. She was also, if anyone had asked her to be honest with herself, drawn to Max less for who he was as a person and more for what he represented, a clear, visible path upward, a man who would eventually run a company with 40 years of history and a reputation across 3 states. She had met Haley exactly twice, both times at company functions, and both times had come away with the same impression, a pleasant, quiet, slightly out-of-place woman who seemed to have little connection to the business itself, someone she privately thought of, without much guilt, as simply the wife. She was not a villain in the way villains exist in simpler stories. She made a choice that hurt people, and she made it while telling herself a series of small justifications that allowed her to keep making it, the way most people who do real harm to others do, not through pure malice but through a slow accumulation of self-permission. She believed, because Max had implied it to her more than once, that his marriage had been cooling for years before she arrived, that she was stepping into a space that was already mostly empty. Whether that was fully true or a story Max needed to tell both of them to make his own choices feel smaller, no one can say with certainty. What is clear is what happened on the night of the gala, and what happened in the weeks that followed it. Haley drove home that night to a house that felt larger and quieter than usual, a colonial just outside Worcester that she and Max had bought 3 years earlier, with a nursery half finished down the hall, paint samples still taped to the wall where they had not yet agreed on a color. She sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the baby shift inside her in slow, unhurried movements that seemed almost comically calm given everything else happening around her. She thought about the 11 months. She thought about the conference room that smelled like burnt coffee. She thought about Raymond crying and gripping her hand, and about the parking lot afterward, and about how easy it had felt, at 26 years old and newly in love, to believe that giving up credit for something was the same as giving up nothing at all. Max came home a little after midnight, smelling faintly of bourbon and someone else's perfume, though Haley did not let herself name that second smell out loud, not that night. He found her still sitting in the dark kitchen and seemed, for a moment, genuinely confused by her silence, the particular confusion of a man who has said something cutting and then watched the person he said it to simply leave, denying him the satisfaction of either an argument or an apology. "You didn't have to storm out like that," he said. "It was a joke. Everyone laughs at stuff like that at these things." "I know," Haley said, and that was all she said, and something about the flatness of her voice unsettled him more than anger would have, though he did not stay long enough to sit with that feeling. He went upstairs. She stayed in the kitchen a while longer, and somewhere in that hour alone in the dark, something in her that had been bending quietly for 6 years finally, without drama, without a single raised voice, stopped bending. The next several weeks moved with the strange double rhythm of a life that looks, from the outside, almost entirely unchanged, while something underneath it has already shifted permanently. Haley continued managing her vendor relationships. She continued attending her prenatal appointments, now every 2 weeks as she moved further into her 3rd trimester, sitting in waiting rooms with parenting magazines she did not read, listening to her own heartbeat and the baby's heartbeat side by side on the monitor, 2 distinct rhythms that the doctor pointed out to her each time with the same gentle reassurance. Max continued going to work, increasingly, finding reasons to stay late, to travel for client meetings that Haley no longer asked detailed questions about, because some part of her had already begun gathering the kind of certainty that does not need to be spoken aloud to exist. One of those appointments, in late September, fell on a Wednesday morning that Max had promised, weeks earlier, to attend. He did not come. He texted 40 minutes beforehand, citing a vendor call that could not be moved, and Haley sat alone in the small exam room, in a paper gown that crinkled every time she shifted her weight, and watched the ultrasound technician's face for any sign of concern as the wand moved across her stomach. There was none. The baby was healthy, measuring exactly where she should be, heart rate strong and steady on the monitor. The technician, a kind woman named Susan who had done 3 of Haley's previous scans, asked, gently, whether Dad would be joining for the next one, and Haley said that she wasn't sure, and something in her own voice surprised her, a flatness she had not intended and could not quite take back once she heard it out loud. She remembered, walking out to the parking lot afterward, a printout of the ultrasound image folded into her purse, that she had imagined this part of her life very differently when she was younger, sitting on the floor of her father's office with a clipboard on her knees. She had imagined a husband in the room for every appointment, a partner who asked the questions she was too tired to ask herself, someone whose hand she could hold during the parts that frightened her. She did not allow herself to dwell long on the gap between that imagined life and the one she was actually living, because dwelling on it without a plan to address it felt, to her, like a kind of self-injury she no longer had patience for. But she noticed the gap. She let herself notice it fully, once, in the car, before she started the engine and drove home to an empty house and made herself dinner alone, the way she had been making dinner alone, in practice if not in name, for longer than she had wanted to admit. Her obstetrician, an older physician named Dr. Linfield who had delivered babies in that same hospital for over 30 years, asked Haley directly, at the appointment after that one, whether everything at home was all right. He asked it the way doctors of his generation sometimes did, without much delicacy but with real attentiveness, watching her blood pressure readings climb slightly higher than they had at previous visits, watching the tension in her shoulders as she answered his questions about sleep and appetite and stress. Haley told him, honestly, that things at home were difficult, without elaborating further, and Dr. Linfield did not press her for details. He simply told her, in the plain, unhurried way he delivered most of his advice, that stress in the final trimester was something worth taking seriously, not as a moral failing to be willed away, but as a physical reality the body kept score of whether a person acknowledged it or not, and that she should not be afraid to ask for help, from him, from family, from anyone willing to actually give it. It was Patricia who finally said something, on a Thursday afternoon in October, when Haley stopped by the office to drop off a signed vendor contract and found Patricia alone in the back office with the particular stillness of someone who has been deciding, for days, whether to speak. "I'm not the kind of woman who tells other people's business," Patricia said, not looking up from her ledger at first. "I've kept plenty to myself in this office over the years. But I've also watched you, Haley, since you were 26 years old sitting in that conference room saving this whole place, and I think you deserve to know what I'm seeing, even if it's not really mine to tell." What Patricia told her that afternoon was not, in itself, proof of anything beyond suspicion, a pattern of charges and absences and a name that kept appearing where it should not. But it confirmed something Haley had already, quietly, allowed herself to believe in the weeks since the gala, and there is a particular kind of grief that arrives not in the moment of discovery but in the moment a private fear becomes a fact spoken out loud by someone else. If you have ever had a suspicion confirmed by someone you trusted, rather than by the person who actually owed you the truth, you know there is a strange double loneliness in that, the loss itself, and then the smaller, quieter loss of realizing the person closest to the situation was never going to be the one to tell you. Haley did not confront Max that night, or the next. She found, instead, that she needed time to sit with what she now knew, not because she was afraid of him, but because she recognized that the conversation she eventually had with him would also, inevitably, become a conversation about the 11 months, about the conference room, about everything she had agreed to set aside 6 years earlier. She could feel those two threads, the affair and the restructuring, the present betrayal and the older invisible sacrifice, beginning to braid together in her mind, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she was not simply grieving a marriage anymore. She was beginning to reckon with a much longer pattern of having made herself smaller than the truth. How do you know the difference between generosity and self-erasure? Both can look, from the outside and sometimes even from the inside, like love. Both involve giving something up for someone else's comfort. But generosity tends to leave a person feeling, even in the moment of sacrifice, that they are still whole, still seen, still themselves underneath the gift they are giving. Self-erasure is quieter than that, and far more dangerous, because it convinces a person that disappearing a little at a time is simply the price of being loved, until one day they look in the mirror, or sit alone in a dark kitchen at midnight, and find they can no longer locate the edges of who they actually are. She did not confront Max about the affair directly for almost 3 weeks. What she did, instead, quietly, on a gray Tuesday afternoon while he was traveling for what he had told her was a client visit in Albany, was drive to the regional bank where, 6 years earlier, she had signed a personal guarantee as part of the Harlow Freight restructuring. She kept the original documents from that arrangement in a safe deposit box there, copies of the loan guarantee, the restructuring agreement, correspondence with the lender that bore her name and her signature throughout, a paper record of 11 months that had otherwise existed only in her own memory and in Patricia's careful, mostly unread ledgers. She did not yet know what she intended to do with these papers. She simply knew, sitting in the small private viewing room with the metal box open in front of her, that she needed to see them again, to confirm to herself that the 11 months had truly happened, that she had not somehow imagined the scale of what she had given up the right to claim. She visited her father 2 days later. Earl Crawford was 71 years old by then, mostly retired, though he still drove to one of his old stores twice a week, he said, to keep the staff honest, though everyone understood it was really because he did not know what else to do with a Tuesday morning. He noticed something was wrong in Haley almost the moment she walked through his door, the way fathers sometimes notice things about their grown children that no one else does, a tightness around the eyes, a stillness in the way she moved that did not match a woman 7 months pregnant and otherwise healthy. They sat at his kitchen table, the same table where Haley had done homework on a clipboard 30 years earlier, and Earl made coffee for himself and herbal tea for her without being asked, and waited, the way he had always waited, for her to say what she needed to say in her own time. "I think Max is having an affair," Haley finally said. "And I think I let myself disappear a long time before that, in a different way, and I don't know how to fix either thing, or if either thing can even be fixed." Earl did not say what some fathers might have said, the predictable things about that man never being good enough for her, about coming home, about letting him handle it. He had never been that kind of father, in business or otherwise. Instead he asked her, gently, to tell him the whole thing from the beginning, and she did, and when she got to the part about the restructuring, about the parking lot conversation 6 years earlier, she watched her father's face change in a way she had not expected. "I always wondered why you stopped talking about that," Earl said quietly. "I noticed it, you know. After the wedding, you used to mention it sometimes, the work you did to save that company. Then one day you just stopped. I thought maybe it embarrassed you somehow, bringing up money troubles from his family. I didn't think to ask if someone had asked you to stop." He didn't make me, Haley said. I agreed to it. I know you did, Earl said. But there's a difference between agreeing to something and being given a real choice about it. I've watched men do that to women plenty of times in my life, in business and outside it. Sometimes it's not even on purpose. Sometimes a man just can't stand the idea of needing someone, so he asks them to make the need invisible, and calls it kindness when she agrees. They sat with that for a while, the coffee going cold in front of Earl, the tea going cold in front of Haley, and then Earl said something that Haley would carry with her through everything that followed. You don't need me to fix this for you, he said. You already fixed something a lot harder than this once, by yourself, when you were younger than you are now and had a lot less reason to believe in your own judgment. Whatever you decide to do here, I think you already have everything you need to do it. I'm not going anywhere. But this one's yours. 3 weeks later, in early November, the confrontation Haley had been bracing for arrived sooner than she expected, and not in the form she had imagined. Max came home on a Sunday evening with a tightness in his voice that Haley recognized immediately as the particular tone of a man who has decided something difficult and is trying to make it sound like simple practicality. He told her, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, that he thought the marriage wasn't working, that he had tried for a long time, that maybe it was best for both of them to start talking about what came next, before the baby arrives, so things aren't more complicated later. Haley listened to the whole speech, which she suspected, correctly, had been rehearsed, possibly with input from someone else, though she did not yet say that part out loud. When he finished, she asked him a single question. What does what comes next look like to you, specifically? Max hesitated, and in that hesitation Haley heard the answer before he gave it. He talked about the house, about how it made sense for him to keep it since his name had been the one on the original purchase paperwork, though Haley knew, and he likely knew, that her income had covered a substantial portion of the mortgage payments for 3 years. He talked about the company, in vague terms at first, then more specifically, saying that since the business had always been a Harlow family matter, it made sense for any separation agreement to keep her separate from it entirely, financially and otherwise. And then, in a tone that he clearly intended to sound reasonable rather than threatening, he mentioned that, given everything, meaning, Haley understood, given that she had no income independent of him on paper, given that her name was not on the company in any official capacity, custody arrangements going forward should probably reflect who's actually been providing stability. Haley sat very still while he spoke, both hands resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the particular vertigo of watching a future she had once trusted rearrange itself in real time into something unrecognizable. She asked him, carefully, what he meant by stability, and he said, without seeming to hear how it sounded out loud, that he had a steady income, a recognized position at a respected company, a family name that meant something in the community, things a judge would presumably weigh, he said, against a wife who had not worked a conventional job in years and whose name appeared on no deed, no title, no piece of paper that would mean anything to a court. It took Haley a long moment to find her voice, not because she doubted what she knew, but because some old, quieter part of her, the part that had agreed 6 years earlier to disappear from her own accomplishment, still wanted to apologize for taking up space in this conversation at all. She recognized that impulse the moment it surfaced, and she recognized, just as quickly, that giving into it now would cost her something she was no longer willing to spend. You're telling me, she said slowly, that the years I spent making myself invisible so you could look more capable are the same years you're now planning to use as proof that I'm not capable of anything at all. Max did not have an answer for that. He looked, for a moment, almost uncertain, as though some part of him recognized the shape of what he had just said and did not entirely like it, before the uncertainty closed back over into the same brittle composure he had carried into the kitchen. I'm just being realistic, he said. About what a judge would actually see. He did not say where the idea of a judge's likely perspective had come from, and Haley did not ask, though she had her suspicions, and those suspicions would later prove, through Carolyn, to be substantially accurate. She did not argue with him that night. She did not cry in front of him, though she cried later, alone, in the bathroom, with the water running so the sound would not carry. What she did, the following morning, was call an attorney, a woman named Carolyn Whitfield who had been recommended to her by a former colleague from her banking days, and she told Carolyn the entire story, from the 11 months 6 years earlier through the conversation at the kitchen table the night before. Carolyn listened carefully, and when Haley finished, she asked a question that reframed everything Haley had been quietly afraid of for weeks. Do you still have documentation from that restructuring? Anything with your name on it, your signature, correspondence showing your direct involvement? I have all of it, Haley said. I kept it in a safe deposit box. Then you are not in the position you think you're in, Carolyn told her. You are not a wife with no claim to anything. You are a woman with documented proof that she personally guaranteed and restructured the debt of a family business, work that has real, demonstrable financial value, work that any reasonable court would consider relevant both to the marital estate and to your capacity to provide stability for this child. The only reason it doesn't feel that way right now is because, for 6 years, you agreed to let other people believe a different story. Haley spent the next 2 weeks, with Carolyn's guidance, organizing every piece of documentation from the restructuring into a clear, chronological record. Patricia, when Haley finally told her what was happening, did not hesitate to provide her own corroborating records from the company's books, the entries she had made herself during those 11 months, proof that aligned precisely with the paperwork in Haley's safe deposit box. It was Patricia, in fact, who suggested the form the eventual confrontation should take. Raymond deserves to hear this properly, Patricia said. Not through a lawyer's letter. Not through gossip. He's an old man who built that company with his own hands, and whatever's happened in his son's marriage, he deserves to understand who actually saved the thing he spent his whole life building, before anyone else decides what story he gets to believe about it. So it was Patricia who arranged the meeting, the second week of December, in the same conference room at the lender's office where the original restructuring had been signed 6 years before, a detail Haley had not requested but recognized, when she walked in and saw the same scarred conference table, the same window looking out onto a parking lot now dusted with early snow, as a kind of quiet justice she had not needed to engineer herself. Present in the room were Raymond, in his wheelchair, Carolyn Whitfield representing Haley, the company's longtime attorney representing Harlow Freight's interests, and Max, who had been told only that there was a matter related to the original financing that required his presence, and who arrived visibly uneasy, sensing, perhaps, more than he could yet name. Haley did not raise her voice during that meeting. She did not need to. She laid the documents on the table in the same chronological order Carolyn had helped her organize, the original loan covenant analysis she had drafted by hand, the correspondence with the lender bearing her signature, the personal guarantee agreement, Patricia's corroborating ledger entries from those same 11 months. She explained, calmly, what each document represented, walking Raymond through the actual sequence of events from the spring of that year 6 years earlier, the conversation at his own dinner table where he had first mentioned the company's troubles, the introduction through her father, the months of work, the signing in this very room. Raymond Harlow sat very still as she spoke. He was a man who had spent 4 decades reading balance sheets and negotiating with suppliers, and Haley watched something settle in his face as he recognized, document by document, that the story did not contradict anything he had personally witnessed 6 years earlier, the late nights, the meetings he had been told Max was leading, the relief that had washed over the family when the crisis passed. It simply restored the actual sequence of who had done what, replacing 6 years of a different version with the version that had been true all along. I cried in this room, Raymond said quietly, after Haley finished. I remember exactly what I said. I said I didn't know how to thank you for this. He looked at Haley for a long moment. I said that to you. I remember now. I just let myself believe, somewhere along the way, that I'd really been thanking my son. Max had not spoken through any of this. When he finally did, his voice carried none of the easy confidence Haley remembered from the gala stage. I never told you it was a lie, he said to his father, which was true in the most narrow possible sense and false in every way that mattered. You let me believe it, Raymond said. For 6 years, you let me believe it, and you let me say things, in front of the board, in front of people who've worked for this family their whole lives, that gave you credit that belonged to your wife. I don't think I need to ask you why. I think I already know, and I think the answer makes me sadder than I have room to feel right now. The room was quiet for a long moment. The company's attorney finally spoke, carefully, noting that regardless of how the personal matters between Haley and Max were resolved, the company's own records would need to be corrected to accurately reflect the historical contributions to the restructuring, both for governance reasons and, frankly, because Patricia's books and Haley's documents told a story the company's own internal records had never fully captured. What happened in the weeks following that meeting did not unfold as a dramatic public reckoning. There was no announcement to the press, no humiliating scene at a second gala to mirror the first one. Raymond, in the careful, deliberate way he had always run the company, began the process of adjusting Harlow Freight's leadership structure, moving Max into a role with clearly defined operational responsibilities rather than the ambiguous heir-apparent position he had occupied before, a change Raymond framed, accurately, as long overdue regardless of the marriage's outcome. Max's relationship with Vanessa did not survive the months that followed, not because of any dramatic confrontation, but because the version of the future Vanessa had been drawn to, a man on a clear and certain path to running a respected regional company, no longer existed in quite the same shape, and the version of Max that remained, a man recalibrating his own sense of who he actually was, held less appeal for her than the man she had believed him to be. The divorce itself, once Haley's documented contributions to the marital estate were established, proceeded on terms that were fair rather than vindictive. Haley did not seek to take the company from Max, or to publicly diminish him beyond the truth that had already, quietly, diminished him on its own. What she sought, through Carolyn, was simple, a fair division of marital assets that accounted honestly for both her financial contributions and her invisible labor, and a custody arrangement that reflected the reality of who had been present, attentive, and stable throughout the pregnancy, rather than a fiction about who had actually been providing for the family. There is a particular kind of relief, Haley would later say, in no longer needing to perform a story that was not true, even after everything that story had cost her. It is not the same as happiness. It does not erase grief. But it makes room for something quieter and more durable than happiness, which is the simple experience of being recognized, finally, as exactly who you actually are. Her daughter was born on a snowy morning in late January, 6 weeks after the meeting in that conference room, in a hospital 20 minutes from the house Haley would keep as part of the eventual settlement. Earl Crawford was in the waiting room the entire time, the way he had once waited, decades earlier, for Haley herself to be born, and when he finally held his granddaughter for the first time, he did not say anything especially profound. He simply looked down at the baby's face for a long moment and said, "Well, there you are," in the same tone he might have used to greet a long-delayed delivery he had been expecting for years, and Haley, exhausted and tearful in the hospital bed, laughed for the first time in months. The early days of single motherhood that followed were not easy, and this story would not be honest if it suggested otherwise. There were nights of broken sleep, the particular loneliness of caring for an infant without a partner in the next room, the slow, unglamorous work of building a new daily rhythm out of the wreckage of an old one. Patricia visited often, in those first months, bringing casseroles and unsolicited but generally accurate advice about infant sleep schedules, and her presence in those early weeks became, in its own quiet way, a kind of family that had nothing to do with bloodlines or marriage certificates. Raymond, too, remained present in his granddaughter's life in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. He visited every other Sunday, the wheelchair making the trip slightly complicated but never enough to stop him, and he would sit with the baby in his lap for an hour at a time, talking to her about the company he had built, about the early years with 2 trucks and a rented lot, the same way he might once have hoped to tell those stories to a grandchild raised inside an unbroken version of the family. The version that actually existed was more complicated than the one he had once imagined. He seemed, in his quieter moments, to have made a kind of peace with that complexity, the way people sometimes do once they stop needing a story to be simple in order to find it meaningful. What does it actually mean to give someone credit for the truth of who they are, and what do we lose, both as individuals and in our relationships, when we ask the people who love us to make their own contributions invisible in order to protect our comfort? Haley Crawford did not set out, at 26 years old, to teach anyone a lesson about that question. She set out, simply, to save a company because she had the skill to do it and loved a man who needed her help. It took her 6 years, a public humiliation, a discovered betrayal, and a quiet conference room meeting in December to understand that the help she gave and the credit she gave away were never actually the same gift, and that she had a right to reclaim one without regretting the other. By the following autumn, almost a year after the night of the gala, Haley had built a life that looked, from the outside, considerably smaller than the one she had occupied as Max Harlow's wife, a modest house instead of the colonial, a part-time consulting arrangement with 2 small businesses her father had connected her with rather than a seat at Harlow Freight's table. But it looked, from the inside, considerably larger, in the ways that mattered. She spoke, now, when people asked about her background, about the 11 months she had spent restructuring a company's debt at 26 years old. She did not say it boastfully. She said it the way her father had always talked about his own early years in business, plainly, as simply what had happened, a fact about herself she no longer needed anyone's permission to claim. Her daughter, whom she named Margaret, after Haley's own grandmother, was nearly 9 months old by then, sitting up on her own, reaching for things with the particular fierce concentration of a baby just beginning to understand that the world could be grasped, pulled toward her, made hers through simple persistent effort. Haley would sometimes watch her daughter reach for a toy just out of arm's length, watch her strain and stretch and eventually succeed, and feel something settle in her own chest that she recognized, slowly, as a kind of quiet promise she intended to keep for the rest of her daughter's life, that Margaret would never need to learn, the way Haley had needed to learn, that loving someone sometimes meant disappearing a little at a time. That the things she built, whatever they turned out to be, would always, from the very beginning, have her own name attached to them. There is no single moment in this story where everything resolves neatly, no scene where every consequence lands exactly where it should and every wound closes completely. Max remained, in his diminished but still real role at Harlow Freight, a father to Margaret on the agreed schedule, present at recitals and birthdays in the years that followed, a more honest version of himself than he had been before, though honesty arrived for him only after it had been forced into the open rather than chosen freely. Raymond grew older, his health continuing its slow decline, but he spent his final working years, before eventually stepping back from the company entirely, having corrected, as best he could, the record of who had actually saved the business he loved. Vanessa moved, within a year, to a position with a logistics firm in another state, and whatever she carried forward from those months, regret or simple forgetting, remains her own. What is certain is what happened to Haley Crawford, because her own life is the one thread running through every part of this story. She learned, at 26, that she had the capacity to save something significant through quiet, sustained effort. She learned, at 32, standing in a ballroom while her husband made a joke at her expense in front of people who had no idea what she had once done for his family, that the same capacity for quiet effort had, somewhere along the way, become a habit of disappearing. And she learned, in the year that followed, that those two truths were not in conflict with each other, that a person could be both genuinely generous and genuinely deserving of recognition, that giving credit away once out of love did not obligate her to keep giving it away indefinitely out of habit. Most of us will never restructure a company's debt, never sign a personal guarantee in a conference room that smells like burnt coffee, never stand in a ballroom while someone we love turns our quiet contribution into a joke for an audience of strangers. But most of us, at some point, will face a smaller version of the same choice Haley faced twice, once at 26 and once again at 32, the choice between making ourselves smaller for someone else's comfort and insisting, gently but completely, on being seen as exactly who we actually are. There is no guaranteed reward for choosing the second option. Haley did not get her marriage back, and she would likely tell you, if you asked her honestly, that she did not particularly want it back by the time the truth finally surfaced. What she got instead was something quieter and, in the end, more durable, the simple, hard-earned experience of no longer needing anyone else's permission to claim the truth of her own life. If this story brought up something in your own experience, a contribution that went uncredited, a sacrifice that was asked of you and called love, a moment where you finally stopped bending and found, to your own surprise, that you were still standing, you are welcome to share that here. These stories tend to mean the most when they are not just watched, but recognized. Thank you for spending this time with Haley's story.